And then also we are only 2 parts in, and I feel like there's all these big concepts that are like all these balls in the air floating around, maybe in an erratic orbit, if you want to think of it that way. And I'm still waiting to see how this is going to come together. I'm like, I can't see what's happening and how this is going to interact, and to sort of stretch that metaphor. Welcome, friends, to episode 306 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week, we start our journey with Cixin Liu's 2008 novel, The Three-Body Problem. All right, James, so we are diving into something just really different from what we've covered so far on this podcast, and that's big, heady, hard sci-fi epic series. We're just getting started with it, but primarily, you know, it's like something outside of our culture. So I'm feeling a bit like a fish out of water here. I don't know about you.
So yeah, we've covered heady sci-fi, but like you said, completely translated from another culture. It definitely feels like there's some context that you have to go in with. And specifically the Cultural Revolution was something I went out of my way to read some about. I was vaguely familiar. I took like a history of Chinese cinema class in college at UF. That was just like a whole world of history and like, you know, censorship and all kinds of stuff like that we can get into. But yeah, I definitely feel it in this story. But I want to say surprisingly, like I didn't know what to expect with the story. I kind of tried to avoid any spoilers up to this point, and we knew that like the Weiss and Benioff were from Game of Thrones fame were coming over to create this show. So I kind of was, you know, wary, but this is led off with a really interesting premise and like you said, very heady, rich sci-fi.
Absolutely. I think we should lay out what we're going to do here for everybody. So early on in this episode, we're going to be spoiler free completely. And then we're going to move into talking about the author. We're going to talk about the history of this book a little bit, but also just to note, we haven't finished it. We've only read parts 1 and 2. There's a third part where everything's going to, like, a lot of answers are going to be given that we don't have yet. So not only are we spoiler free, but we're also like unable to spoil the end of the book because we haven't even got there yet. And then after we talk about the author and the book a little bit, then we'll get into some light spoilers. But this is even going to be like maybe a little lighter than our normal coverage. So if you're like a longtime listener, it might seem a little different than what we normally do. But we just thought that it would be good to kind of keep this at a macro level for now. And then we're going to dive into the show, and we're going to have plenty of opportunity to talk about more of the specifics of what's going on plot-wise. Whereas this will be a little bit more broader view of how we're feeling about the book so far.
This week we're doing the parts 1 and 2 of the book. Next week we're going to come back and we'll have done the first half of the show. And then for our third episode, we plan to do the end of the book and the show so that we kind of conserve the secrets and the answers till the very end, that final episode.
Yeah, so that'll be the coverage. You can look forward to that, hopefully. I should also mention, maybe obviously, we are reading the translated version here, Ken Liu's translation, which is pretty well renowned. It's part of this book went on to win the Hugo in 2014, this translation in particular, which we could talk about more of that history. But I think it's really, really solid translation to where, especially like the written version I have, there's a bunch of these little like footnotes that explain certain context that like was really welcomed. It was like, yeah, this is this thing, and you can like, if you want to know more about it, go look into it. But like, here's just a brief little snippet about what this is. And so I do recommend the written version for that. But also, I've been listening to some of the audiobook because these names are very difficult for me, I know zero Chinese and very bad at pronunciations. And, you know, James and I listened to a bunch of pronunciation guides and stuff going into this, but I'm sure we are going to mess up some of it. So just trying to kind of own that it's going to be a thing. Just doing my best, and that's all I can do.
So you talked about those like kind of footnotes that gave context, and like you said, very welcome. And important because I feel like there's an interesting bias that comes with any culture, right? Like we're a Western culture looking at this, like there are different values and things that speak to a Chinese audience differently than it would to us, like just inherently. So getting a lot of that stuff for context and understanding some of the reasons why characters would react certain ways and maybe that we don't necessarily understand, it was very helpful. But I find this kind of diving into a story like this to be so fascinating to me, because it is kind of that cultural exploration in a way, and finding out like what's true to another character or another person, like what their motivations and values may be.
Yeah.
And then yeah, just being someone who likes to engage with history and kind of look back. I don't even pretend to be an expert or anything close to it on any of these subjects, but the Cultural Revolution is just very complex, and looking, it's horrific. It's there's just so much that went on with it. Seeding
Has like
this,
this mixed legacy now, and
yeah,
yeah.
seeding this story in that comes with so much baggage right away, and ground really just grounding this story that gets into some really crazy futuristic sci-fi territories with something that's so like human, and like the tragedies and like some of like what human beings are capable of if directed in the wrong ways, or influenced in those ways. So yeah, and then kind of how that might reflect in a future sense what could be happening with some of the other story that we get.
Yeah, and I was struggling a little bit with this because the Chinese government is like famously controlling and censoring of its own people, and it doesn't like being challenged, and there's a lot of oppression that goes on over there. But admittedly, I'm all viewing it all through a Western lens, and what I get through my media over here. Like, we're all in our own ecosystems. I'd like to think that the internet sometimes helps with that a little bit, right? Like, you can kind of get independent insight, but even that, you have to vet it, and like who knows where it's coming from and what their agenda might be. And this book touches on some of that kind of stuff in an interesting way that I wasn't even sure I was going to expect from this sort of a book originating from China. But what if I kind of zoom out, and that's kind of the way I look at it, because like I am, and if you look at the history of our podcast, we are highly critical of America pretty frequently in our coverage of different things, right? And we feel comfortable doing that because we've grown up here and we know like the ins and out of our politics and what sides of it we don't agree with. And we podcasted through the entire Trump presidency, where we were very anti a lot of what was going on.
And we're wary of nationalism and a lot of that stuff that boils up in even, American politics all over the world.
And we value the fact that it is honestly a privilege of ours that we have that right within our country, and the way it's formulated currently, at least, to be critical of the government, like publicly, and not be jailed for it. Whereas that's not necessarily true in China. So a lot of people, it's good. They have to talk about this stuff through that lens. What I'm trying to get at is, broadly, the West has historically been caught up in like the idea of individualism, and the East, and especially China, is much more the commune, the group, right? Like the society. And it's interesting to look at a big sci-fi epic like this and see that it's fundamentally a little bit more about the group and about society and about how we as humanity might go forward. And that is pretty counter to what we typically get in Western narratives, where it's much more individual focused. So, obviously I'm keeping things as spoiler free as possible, but just like that's something that I was able to appreciate. And you can kind of separate that out from like whatever the current political situation is. That's like generally a big difference in reading something from China versus reading something from America.
And like you mentioned before, like the freedoms, I think it's easy in today's political climate for people to get caught up in being like, you hate America, you love America too much. And like, there's a lot of that going on. But like you said, the freedoms that we do have currently, that we fight for, allow us to speak so broadly. And again, that censorship of information is what always scares me. Anyone who wants to stifle anyone's voice, or crossing of information, banning books, banning any of that kind of stuff, gets really, gets into that totalitarian kind of authoritarian regime very quickly. And so like that's definitely something that I value, and I just wanted to point out and think about as we're talking about this cultural revolution. And just in reading this book, I was thinking a lot about the censorship in China, or at least what I hear of the censorship in China, and in getting into the book's details, I was surprised at some of the takedowns, I would say, of some of the history of what's gone on, because I think typically that kind of stuff is stifled, and a lot of this, like you said, has to be filtered through the government and through the party. And to see this book and in its current form, and to see that like it is acknowledging some of these things being bad, and certain practices being kind of evil or seen as like not in a good light. I'm surprised that this slipped through to the rest of the world. And also, like, you know, what with what we hear sometimes in the Western media, like thinking about the safety of this author, and like, what, you know, if you're speaking out in this way, although subliminally, which I guess I should note, like that's such a major part of Chinese like art, and specifically film, when I studied it, is like, what can you subliminally put into a story that will speak to a certain person, certain morality, certain thing that you're trying to get across to an audience, that can slip through censors and individuals like that are trying to like stifle messaging in that way, and metaphor, and you know, that kind of thing. And if that was maybe the situation here, if maybe this is just layered enough, although it doesn't seem that way to me, to slip through and make it through to the rest of the world.
It seems obvious, right? As we're reading it, it's like, this is clearly bad. As this academics are getting, you know, tortured. And in bringing this up, I'll just touch on it. One thing I did read pertaining to what you're talking about is that the entire opening of this book actually took place in the middle of the book when it was originally released in China. But when it was translated, Ken Liu thought it would be better at the start of it, and contacted the author, and Cixin confirmed that that was actually the intention originally, was to have this opening be the opening to the book, but it was moved to the middle to evade censors. You know, I guess the thought is that they wouldn't read past the beginning, or it would, maybe it was like kind of buried in the middle more. It doesn't seem as important as like the opening to the book. So maybe this is the right way to read it, but I don't know. I guess it's up to debate, because that's not how it was originally published.
Yeah, but like, so did he, like, was he met with any resistance? Were you able to find anything like that as far as the story is concerned?
Not, I mean, a lot of stuff's between the lines, because again, like, he lives in China currently.
Yeah.
So it's like a lot of this stuff is going to be suppressed, and of course it's like being translated, and like what I can get here. And also, I want to also own the fact, just got back from NorwestCon, and read this basically all day yesterday. Did some research, but I am on a compressed timeline. I'm going to be spending more time with this over the next few weeks as we cover three-body problems, so I can look into more of it. But I feel like we're getting a little bit lost from just like general thoughts, experience with the book. Set all that aside. Sci-fi book. We're reading one. How are you liking it so far, James? Are you enjoying the process? How does this stack up to other sci-fi we've read?
I mean, I haven't finished it, so I can't say like ultimately where it lands, but I do find it engaging. Like, I really did, and a lot of these topics are things that maybe we've talked in some sense before, but not necessarily like all at once. There's multiple different entities and powers in play, and it's made for a really interesting read. There's a mystery element that I think is building up really nicely as well, like and almost like kind of like a cosmic horror thing that started out, and I was like, whoa, this is pretty intense.
This is kind of horrifying at parts.
Yeah, and then just like seeding it in this culture and the way that like they're interacting with the different philosophies that come along with it, and then there's sort of the more like conservative look at it some of the time, and more progressive look at it some of the time, and then just like, you know, radicals on either side, and the way that the characters start to talk about this possible entity or thing that we may be contacting with, and what intentions there may or may not be. It's very fascinating, and like, I guess if I was gonna throw something out there as a sort of comparison point, there are small parts of it that remind me of Arrival, which we covered many years ago now, but like just the idea of possible contact with another species, and like what intentions they may or may not have, and how humanity would react to that. And really, if I can say one thing, it's that not all of humanity would be on the same page, and I think that's a lot of what this book is digging into.
It's interesting because it's dealing with like first contact. I don't think that's a huge spoiler to say. It's also dealing with a lot of like really heady concepts that the author will lay out in detail for you on the page. And so that reminded me a little bit of like Andy Weir, I can get a little bit of the Ted Chiang, because like sometimes Ted Chiang would like get into a lot of these concepts about like how light works and then use it as a metaphor to talk about language.
I think it's just not that it's a perfect comparison. I think it's just a touchstone that you can kind of point to and say like that feels a little similar. I know that Ted Chiang is much more interested in like the linguistic element and like how to communicate and like
At least in that story. Yeah, I think Ted Chiang is, to me, his writing is a lot more empathetic and personal, whereas this writing is much more in the tradition of someone like Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, like the golden age of sci-fi American and Western authors, many of whom were influences on the author, in the sense that they tended to focus more on big concepts and less on characters. A lot of like the modern criticisms as we look back at those books is it's like a lot of like fairly flat characters who are just kind of there to serve a purpose, right? And that's to advance this idea we're going to discuss. And there's a little bit of that going on here. Part of it could also be cultural. That might be part of what I'm picking up on, but at times I feel like the characters are pretty distant from me. I don't really feel like I know them well and know what makes them tick and know that what they're thinking and like how they feel about things. I don't know, like a lot of that is kind of withheld, or just left implied. So because of that, it's kind of a cold read, but the concepts are so cool. It includes one of my favorite tropes, which is just like gathering a bunch of experts together to like deal with some weird thing.
Yeah.
Like I love that in all media. I'm a sucker for that. And then like the more mind blowing the thing, the better, right? And we definitely get some of that here. And then yeah, it's like it's huge in scope, obviously just like so ambitious, that I'm always impressed when I see something like this. It's like that someone was able to pull this off is wild. And then yeah, I think there are a lot of subtle criticisms about the over politicizing of truth, right? Like there's objective truth, and that seems to be something that this book like really champions. But then we see whenever you have objective truth and somebody's saying, well, we got to put a spin on it to make sure that we look good, and that our, party looks good and that they think about this the right way, rather than just like putting forward the truth. I think that is like one thing that I would say that this seems to champion. And so that to me in and of itself is always going to be a little bit subtly critical of any controlling power that is going to engage in censorship, right? Because you're stifling the truth literally. So that's stuff that we can circle back to more as we get further into the specifics. But overall, I'm having a good time with it. I will admit that, yeah, it's kind of keeping me at a distance at times. And I really love character. So that's something that I'm missing a bit from this story. But that's not prevented me from enjoying it because there's so much else going on that is so cool. And then also, we are only 2 parts in. And I feel like there's all these big concepts that are like all these balls in the air floating around, maybe in an erratic orbit, if you want to think of it that way. And I'm still waiting to see how this is going to come together. I'm like, I can't see what's happening and how this is going to interact, and to sort of stretch that metaphor for the 3-body problem itself, which, by the way, is a mathematical concept that I did watch a video about to try and get a rough understanding of. And I'm sure I have just the barest understanding of it still.
I do like having a lot of variety in my storytelling. So having a story like this, like you said, this isn't a Ted Chiang story because like you said, his story, especially in Arrival, which I can't remember the title of the short story, but
The Story of Your Life.
That story is so like what's so central to that is that main character's sort of like trauma and the way that like that contact can engage with that. So this doesn't really have that element to me. It has much more like you said, like a macro big look at it. But I like, as far as the variety goes, of like these massive concepts. Like I like a book that gives me like new philosophical roots to think down, or like maybe new concepts that I wasn't familiar with, where like a narrative gives me a concept that in another context may have been really dry, kind of giving me, or at least introducing me to a concept like that I can then, like this book asks you to go read more about.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate
tricking you into
that.
learning some stuff sometimes.
Exactly. Like I like gamifying or storyifying my little tidbits of knowledge. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And Alien Contact is something that sci-fi, Alien First Contact, is something that sci-fi has always been like obsessed with. And so whenever you can have like a modern story come out and make waves and have it be all about that and feel like it's like actually saying something new, It's really cool. And again, we're only getting a bare hints of it right now because we haven't finished the book. But it feels to me like it's really building up to something interesting. And then also, this is a trilogy, which I don't know if we've said that. This is just the first book in a trilogy. Ken Liu returns to translate the third one, but the middle book had a different translator. So I wonder how that affects like the reading experience. Anybody who's read all three, that definitely let us know, because I'm curious if you can like really tell a difference. Because Ken Liu is also like a really well-renowned author in and of himself.
Cool.
So I think that's one of the reasons why this translation is working so well.
Well, I would love to hear more about the author and sort of like how this came about.
Let's do it. Let's talk bio. So Liu was born in 1963 in Beijing, and his parents were sent to work in the mines there. Due to the violence of the Cultural Revolution, he was sent to live in his ancestral home in Lushan County. He would later graduate from the North China University of Water Conservancy and Electric Power. In 1988, he worked as a computer engineer at a power plant. So after his work as an engineer, he would start writing. In 1989, he wrote Supernova Era and China 2185, but neither book was published at the time. His first published short story, Whale Song, was published in Science Fiction World in 1999. So it took him about 10 years to get something published. The same year, his novel With Her Eyes won the Galaxy Award. In 2000, he wrote The Wandering Earth, which also received a Galaxy Award and was adapted into a film in 2019. When the short story Mountain appeared in January 2006, many readers wrote that they hoped Liu would write a novel. He decided to concentrate on novel-length text rather than short stories. Outside of Remembrance of Earth's Past, Liu's novels include Supernova Era and Ball Lightning. When not otherwise busy, Liu wrote 3,000 to 5,000 words a day. Each of his books reportedly took about 1 year to complete. So Remembrance of Earth's Past is the trilogy of The Three-Body Problem. That's the first book of. So that's his writing career. He cites authors like George Orwell and Arthur C. Clarke as important literary influences. He was labeled the first cyberpunk Chinese author after he wrote China 2185. His most famous work is The Three-Body Problem, which was first published in 2006, and it was the first of his Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. American author Ken Liu's 2014 translation, which would be published by Tor Books, won the 2015 Hugo Award for Best Novel, and the book sold over 1 million copies in China before it won. Liu's Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy has been a sensation of the Chinese science fiction literature community within Chinese territory and internationally. In 2012, even the winner of the Nobel Prize of Literature, Mao Yan, acclaimed the remarkable quality of the series. Liu's fiction focuses primarily on problems such as social inequity, scientific development, and ecological limitations that impact humanity. So it's been analyzed by people all over the world, noting that it talks a lot about censorship, self-censorship. Again, we talked about the opening chapters were considered too politically charged by the publisher and were moved deeper into the book when originally published in China to avoid attracting criticism by government censors. But it did well over here once it got translated, right? And in fact, in 2019, the New York Times cited The Three-Body Problem as having helped popularize Chinese science fiction internationally. It earned endorsements by people like George R.R. Martin, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, and former U.S. President Barack Obama. So kind of an interesting range there. George R.R. Martin would write a blog about how it did deserve to win the Hugo Award. And Obama said that it had immense scope and that it was fun to read, partly because my day-to-day problems with the United States Congress seemed fairly petty. So cool. Obama's a fan. So yeah, interesting. Like, this is how big this book is, right? It is really something that has just permeated society, and this I've heard its name so many times, and so I'm glad that we're finally getting to it, and I can kind of see what all the fuss is about. Critics have some interesting takes on it. I want to share a couple of the ones I found. So Kirkus Reviews wrote that, quote, in concept and development, it resembles top-notch Arthur C. Clarke or Larry Niven, but with a perspective, plots, mysteries, conspiracies, murders, revelations, and all, embedded in a culture and politic dramatically unfamiliar to most readers of the West, conveniently illuminated with footnotes courtesy of translator Liu. Joshua Rothman of The New Yorker also called Cixin Liu China's Arthur C. Clarke, and similarly observed that in American science fiction, humanity's imagined future often looks like America's past. For an American reader, one of the pleasures of reading Liu is that his stories draw on entirely different resources, citing that his use of themes relating to Chinese history and politics. So that's kind of what I was saying early on, and I agree with that. Like, it does feel fresh in that way. Matthew A. Morrison wrote that the novel could evoke a response all but unique to the genre, an awe at nature and the universe, which sci-fi readers call a sense of wonder. There are also some critics who pointed out that the novel could represent an endorsement of concepts such as world government, consequentialism, and a tacit approval of China's surveillance and control society. So there's been some pushback on some of the underlying themes, but I think I tend to agree with the idea of it being this, like, truth matters. Let's look at humanity as a whole. And I think that's worthwhile, especially when you're talking about like interplanetary interactions. Of course, you're going to view humanity as a whole. I think that makes sense.
Something else interesting that you talked about too is like the way that this book is kind of engaging with technology and ideas, and how ideas like ultimately can like be a good thing or they can be a bad thing, and how like that maybe reflect some of like his thinking on his history and the Chinese history.
Yeah, and we talked about Arthur C. Clarke when we covered 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
And one of my criticisms of that book was that I felt like it was kind of cold and dispassionate, and more focused on the science than the characters. So I actually don't think, I think he's not as guilty of it as Arthur C. Clarke was, at least in my little limited time reading his stuff. But I can see that comparison, and I do think we need to at least highlight that the author has said some controversial things. So I'm going to lay some of these out. Do with them what you will, listener. According to a June 2019 interview, Liu avoids talking about politics. But in the same article, Liu argued that democracy was not appropriate for modern China, and individual liberty and freedom of governance is, quote, not what Chinese people care about, adding, quote, if you were to loosen up the country a bit, the consequences would be terrifying. He expressed support for policies such as the one-child policy and China's Xinjiang policies. And he said, quote, would you rather that they be hacking away at bodies on train stations and schools and terrorist attacks? So pretty insensitive. And he said, if anything, the government is helping their economy and trying to lift them out of poverty. So a lot of people have looked at the situation there and called it a genocide. I don't admittedly know a ton about this, but it does sound like he's kind of approving of the way that the Chinese government has been dealing with this and oppressing people. Again, he's working within a society where criticism against the government is illegal. But I also don't want to make excuses for it. Could he didn't have to come out and support it either. He could have just said nothing, of course, right? Like, that seems like that's always an option. It's unfortunate. We often talk about people whose politics we don't agree with on this podcast. We also talk about a lot of historical figures. Also, there's this whole thing, cultural differences, us not knowing all the full scale of all these situations and all the ins and outs of it. So I'm just going to say that I do not agree with a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that and I'm like, that I don't agree with that. So,
yeah.
The one child policy, all that kind of stuff. I mean, like that's scary stuff in my opinion, and like a lot of government control there. And him coming out and saying it, not a good look. I do not like that he's saying those things. So it definitely paints kind of how I feel about him as a person.
Yeah.
Like you said, I also kind of see that there's a possibility that some of these statements are made, by being pressured or just like feeling like unsafe in some way. So I'm not going to make excuses in any way.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to make excuses for it either. So I think let's just move on. This was a bit of a controversy around the Netflix adaptation when it was announced. In fact, there were senators who like really, sent a letter to Netflix asking about this, whether they were aware of the remarks and should they even proceed with this adaptation. Netflix responded that Liu was not the creator of the show, and that those comments are, quote, not reflective of the views of Netflix or of the show's creators, nor are they part of the plot or themes of the show. So trying to distance themselves at least from those.
That's an interesting distinction too, though, because like to have senators come and try to say, at least question, why are you making this? Feels a little censory in a sense.
Yeah, well, of course.
Yeah. So, so someone's coming and saying like, why are you making this? And especially if you haven't read it.
I'm not saying I necessarily endorse anything that senators are doing.
if you haven't read it and you just assume based on what someone has said that material that is within the material, I think that that's a little bit, you know, maybe a little controlling.
Well, obviously, China is a hot button issue in America, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So anything that can get hoovered up into the culture war that blazes in our country is always going to. So this show is going to come with a level of controversy in of itself. We haven't even gotten to that. We will definitely touch on that next week when we get to the adaptation, because I know there's a lot of controversy about a lot of the choices that were made with this
And
show.
I do want to use this as an opportunity too to talk about like an artist and like a government or like a political party or a movement or something like that, because it's like individuals in China may or may not believe politically what's going on there, but expression and like art has always been an escape in all societies, and not necessarily just an escape, but a means of expression and a means of like passing on stories and morals and some of these kinds of things that are important to humans. So I do think it's good to think of like, I think there's a reaction, as we heard, to say like, that's a story written by a Chinese person.
Yeah.
And I think that gets very dangerous very quickly when you don't engage with the art, because it's like there's a lot that goes into it, and an individual doesn't speak for a party, or you know, it usually doesn't speak for a party or a people as a whole. It could just be a human expression of you know, their life or what they what they enjoy or what they want to explore.
And again, I think there's an element of like, you can still find value in something even if you don't agree with every aspect of the things it's saying.
Right.
We do that a lot on this podcast, where it's like, don't like this part of it, but I actually do like this other part. We say that all the time. So that's how we're going to engage with this. And again, we haven't finished the book, so I'll see how much how I feel once we get done with it. But I want to move into what we're going to call our light spoiler section, in which I have sort of three just major topics I want to throw out. The first of which is going to be the character we primarily follow in the Cultural Revolution time frame. Now, again, this moves throughout time. We actually start off with her father, who is a victim here by the Red Guard.
Professor at a university who is like going through one of these struggle sessions.
Yeah, gets tortured pretty brutally.
Killed, yeah.
Yeah, by like these young girls, which is very accurate actually for what I was reading about the Cultural Revolution. It's a bunch of like really young children.
Red Guard.
We're doing this, yeah. And so we see that, and it's quite visceral. And then we find out about his daughter, who has witnessed it, and then like
Ye Wenjie.
Yeah. So what did you think of her and her character? We kind of get a good bit of her early on, and then we leave her for a while. And then we get a little bit, you know, later, but like we see her like at a later time frame. But from what I understand, there's a lot of asynchronous stuff going on, and maybe we're going to get some more of this later. From what I was reading.
Yeah, so she followed, you know, interesting. During the Cultural Revolution, because he was an intellectual and stayed firm in his beliefs, he was beaten for them and killed. And she sees this, and this like really like sticks with her, obviously, seeing her father struck down. And then
and like her mother was like on the other side of it.
Yeah.
And it didn't even seem like her mother necessarily believed it. It was just that her mother was really good at like surviving and had read the political winds better than her father had, and was like, I have to do this to survive.
And then she ultimately seems like she like kind of goes crazy and loses her mind when he's ultimately killed. She just starts
talking about
screaming. The wife. The wife. So anyway, the daughter Ye Wenjie, she follows in his footsteps. Like what, 20 years goes by or something, and she's an astrophysicist.
Well, two years at first. And then I think 20 later, but like 2 years at first, she's like somewhere else. She's been reassigned, and she meets this guy who has this book that
that's an important moment.
He like wants help with, and she offers to like translate it for him or write it for him. So but he's going to write this like letter about it, and she offers to help him with it.
She gets this book, and it's a Western book that's kind of talking, it's kind of it seems to be anti pesticides or something along those lines, about like letting nature grow naturally. And at least on the surface, that's what I was getting from it. And she takes it to be like kind of a metaphor for like what's going on with humans and the Chinese seems the culture of the time. And he's writing like some sort of letter of information of some kind to send off to the higher ups, and she like looks it over for him, and in doing that she rewrites it in some way, and then it's in her handwriting, and he gets in trouble for it,
and then he throws her under the bus. And she ends up getting sent to prison basically for it.
But I do want to note too, like there's this moment of like omniscience in the book where it says like that book would paint her ideology for the rest of her life going forward, and that's like kind of a big flag.
It does occasionally step out and give us like a historical perspective on it, which is kind of cool. It kind of shows how grand we're going, so you get a sense of like this has all already happened and we're establishing history kind of thing.
Well, many times, like they talk about the guy who betrayed her here, and they say like his life, like historians have tried to track his life and see if anything else of importance was done, and he had like a really boring life outside of this. And nothing ever came of him.
So she ends up being the one that is important, and she gets taken by helicopter to this this Red Coast base. It's this like radio tower that actually I think is actually like setting out microwaves, she ends up figuring out. And so at first it seems like it's just like being used to like maybe affect enemy planes. She's not really sure, but then she starts to realize that it's like pointed deeper into space, so like something mysterious is going on. And we get this kind of broken up, but and then at one point it's like they're like, I guess we gotta trust her because she knows she's figuring stuff out. She's the smartest person here, so we're gonna like start to clue her in on some of the truth of what's going on here. And we realize that this is actually like China's early version of like SETI, the search for extraterrestrial life intelligence, but it's China's version, and it's like secret. And I think this is kind of true. Again, like a lot of this stuff is like based in reality, but you know, maybe to modify it a little bit. I am also not an expert, so I couldn't tell you for sure. But she's going to be an important figure going forward because she works on this program for her entire career, and then I think she's going to have a lot of the answers. We haven't necessarily got them yet, but we've started to get some interactions, because then what happens is we get this modern day plot line, which is what I wanted to jump to next with Wang. And Wang is in our sort of modern China, and he's this like, he works on this like nanofilament stuff. That's this like kind of really thin, but like hyper strong material that said could like if you put it across the street and a car were to drive through it, like chop it in half. Now I'm like, well, now that's a Chekhov situation where I have to see that happen at some point. But this apparently is like a really important material, and we don't know why. And he's working on that, and he's brought in, and it's a situation that I touched on earlier that I always love, where it's like a bunch of experts are being brought in to talk about a thing that is super mysterious. And then it's actually a twist on that too, because we find out that a lot of the experts who are being brought in are dying because they're killing themselves. And so there's this like rash of like theoretical physicists killing themselves, which if you ever hear about a bunch of theoretical physicists start killing themselves at the same time, like that's going to be a red flag for me that something bad is happening.
Yeah, seriously. It's interesting too, because there's this element that gets introduced that like a bunch of intellectuals like this are being drawn to, and it's this video game, this virtual reality game. Well,
let's set the video game aside for a moment, because that's like the third thing I wanted to talk about, and I want to kind of deal with it as its own thing. But like this part right here, I really was engaged by this. I really like this stuff because it's super creepy. He starts at first dreaming of this number. Well, wait, no, he first sees it. He first sees it in photos. Yeah, so he's taking photos.
I got to nerd out about this for a second, because he has like, I love that it went out of their way to talk about a Leica camera that he's filming with, and I was like, dude, that's like my dream film camera. Like I'd love to have it's a very like photographer camera, and
like
to hear that
he's a professional.
He's like on the side a professional because he does this nanotech stuff. Yeah, and on the side he's also like a successful like a nature photographer of some kind. And so yeah, it was so creepy to like think about like developing the photos and then realizing that there's like numbers stamped on all of them. Yeah, and then he
gets involved with all this, and then this immediately starts happening.
Well, he's and someone tells him to stop too, and like but anyway, he gets involved. He goes through this process of elimination where he like has other people take photos with the same camera, and then he goes and takes photos with digital cameras, and it's always popping up for him. And then he starts seeing it in his dreams, and he starts seeing it around, and he freaks out, goes to a doctor.
So after he sees it in his dream, he sees it in his vision persistently now. It's just in his eyes all the time.
And it's a countdown timer. Like it seems like it's counting
down to something, which is ominous as hell. and yeah, he goes to see an eye doctor, and the eye doctor's like, "Oh yeah, that's probably just a floater." And he's like, "Does it say numbers? Does a floater say numbers?" And he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about. You need to see a psychiatrist." I like this stuff. This stuff was really engaging, and like I can see that this is going to be interesting in the show when this starts happening. You know, because I assume something like this is going to happen in the show, and it's going to be cool.
Yeah, and he keeps crossing paths with these other scientists, and some people like seem to be in on something that he's not in on, and he's trying to figure it out. And he goes to one scientist's house, and her husband is working, and he's on like a VR headset playing the game, and that's kind of when he jumps into the game for the first time. So clearly,
we find out about this game.
People are being drawn into it. Yeah,
it's called Three Body. And this all seems connected to this other organization, Frontiers of Science, and he gets contracted by the government, and this detective who's kind of a character that I actually kind of enjoy because he's super gruff and like really perceptive, and like he's like, I'm not that smart, but then like he perceives a lot, so he's clearly good at perceiving certain things. I don't know, I just like a character like this for Wong to bounce off of here. But specifically, they want him to kind of become a mole, like join this organization, but tell us what's going on because we want to know what's going on with these people. And then they're all connected to this game.
And I have one more thing to add here. There's another layer that we didn't talk about, which is we mentioned before Ye Wenjie, and Ye Wenjie's daughter is also a theoretical physicist or something along those lines. And she kills herself early on in this story. She's one of those scientists who kills herself. And then we meet like her partner, and he is like kind of dealing with obviously her death, but he also has some information for our main character.
Well, he talks to her mother at one point, goes to see her at home, but interspersed with all of this is the stuff with the video game, which I feel like we got to talk about here. So this is so far the wildest part of the book, and also probably my least favorite. I'm curious to know how you feel about it.
Yeah.
It's described as a VR headset you put on, and then you put on a haptic suit, a la Ready Player One, right? We've seen this before, and real life. Like, this is a real thing you can do. We don't normally wear haptic suits when we're doing VR, but VR is obviously a very common thing, and haptic suits do exist. It sounds like these ones are pretty advanced as far as like the level of sensation they're allowed to convey.
We could develop that to being the norm at some point. It's just not currently.
Sure, but I struggle a little bit, and this came up with Ready Player One, but because it's a different kind of book, I was able to suspend my disbelief a little more than this kind of book. But like, it acts as if you are in another world when you're in this VR game. And like, having played a lot of VR, like, I'm always very aware that I have a VR headset on, that there's like space between my eyes and the lens that I'm seeing. Like, it's not like, it feels like a simulation, and it like, you can look around and it's like, oh wow, it looks like I'm looking somewhere else, but you're always very aware that you're not actually somewhere else. It's presented as if he's transported to another like bizarre universe where all the rules of physics are different and time progresses differently, and it feels as if he's actually there. And I'm always like, why don't they just do some sort of brain interface thing? Because then I could start to believe that maybe if we've got an advanced way to do like this brain interface, that we're fooling the brain into literally thinking we're somewhere else. But from what I understand so far, again, maybe this will be explained more later, this is just a set of goggles you put on, and yet somehow transports you to this like surrealist world that is very unlike our own. And again, time behaves differently, and like, I don't know, like it was hard for me to conceptualize it in a way. But then also, even when I did set all that aside and say, okay, this is what we're doing, it's really weird. There's this whole like, so it's this world that is governed by this chaotic, seems like these chaotic stars that are in orbit. And this touches on the three-body problem, which I did look up. So the three-body problem, in the roughest, most layman's sort of way I can talk about it, is essentially like a theorem that has long been considered like unsolvable, and yet over time there has been a lot of people to propose different solutions to it, and they all have like certain use cases where they've been proven to be true, but it seems like broadly still unsolvable. And it's just that when you start getting sufficiently massed objects, if you have two of them orbiting each other, like, we can calculate that no problem, and we can kind of predict its behavior. But when you add a third, it immediately gets chaotic in a way that becomes mathematically like impossible to predict outside of certain very key circumstances, which get talked about in the book. So we talk about a lot of these like proposed solutions, but the problem is a lot of them don't like occur in nature. So it's like, if it was like this, we could be able to do it. Anyway, but that's why everybody's trying to solve. They're trying to predict when we're gonna have like these chaotic eras versus these stable eras, because the stable eras are when society can actually progress. And what these people do in this society is they dehydrate their bodies into like strips of leather, and then they get rolled up and like packed away, in which they can be like injured and stuff while they're in this state, and then they get rehydrated. And it's to avoid this like drying out or mass freezing or like extreme weather events that happen because of the interaction of these bodies, these planetary bodies, and these stars. Because there's like 3 stars in this system. It's wild because like like Wang is the character, and he immediately like creates a login, but then he like kind of adopts a persona as like a religious figure, but he's also trying to like solve some of these theorems, and he can't tell all the time if other people he's interacting with are players or if they're like create like just like computer programs, NPCs essentially, or like is something else controlling them? I don't know. And everybody's human, and yet we're describing a society that seems very inhuman. So my suspicion is that this is actually kind of a history or some sort of representation of what's been going on. And this is my most spoiler thought. So again, I haven't read the end, so this is just prediction territory. This feels like this is all stuff about like this other alien society.
Yeah, which we do find out at the end of this, that we find out that there's like, this is some sort of facade for an actual alien race.
Yeah, that's like on their way to Earth.
Yeah.
So they have sent this somehow in advance, and it's like telling the story of maybe why they're coming, but also like what they're trying to do is unclear and to some extent, but it does seem like they're trying to get an advanced word of like where they're from, and what they're coming, because they want to come to our solar system because it's stable. Yeah, that seems like a like way preferable to the instability they've been having to deal with.
That does seem to be the case, and I think what I'm gathering is that this is some sort of like sympathy play towards humans, is to say like, look at what we are going through. We cannot solve for this, and also like maybe you can solve it with like this communication. It's like
getting people involved. Help us.
Some of so it's appearing as Earth. The planet is like strangely appearing as Earth, and then the characters, like the people who get rehydrated,
historical figures,
show up as historical figures, which I thought was really fun and wild. Like
sometimes it looks like medieval Europe, sometimes it looks like China, sometimes all these different places. And
Isaac Newton, we get like Einstein,
actual kings from different periods.
So I know that you said that you're like not engaging with this part. I found this to be so fucking weird, and I liked it for that. I was like really I was like, this is so bizarre. I find this to be so cool and different than anything I was expecting. It gets into like maybe some repetitive motions, because he kind of gets there.
We see a lot of different, it's like the fates of a lot of different societies, and he sees them like blow up or like get burned or frozen.
The planet gets like split in half at one point.
Yeah, at one point. So I think that's also like maybe showing what could happen, and that's why they had to leave.
Possibly, yeah.
Is my theory. But it's also like highly interpretive, and we don't really know, like none of this is explained. We're just thrown in the middle of it. It's really weird. And it's, again, like the way he's like interacting with other people who might be players and might be not be, and like it's unclear. And then we find out there are other players, and there are at times where he like confirms, he's like, oh no, that person's username is such and such, it's definitely another player. But like as a gamer, it doesn't feel like a game to me. I think that's the other thing. Like,
that's what I was gonna say, though.
It's not like selling me on the fact that this is a game, and maybe there's an in-universe reason for that. But like for me, at first, I'm just like, this doesn't feel like a game at all.
Well, it's catering to a certain demo, right? It's only bringing in like the smartest, most like all of these intellectuals to try to solve this actual problem. So I think that it's like it's not meant to be like interesting. It's not meant to like pull in the general population. I don't know.
No. And I'm not saying that that's the way it doesn't feel like a game. Because of course, it's like a very hyper specific kind of person who's gonna be interested in this sort of thing.
Exactly.
It doesn't feel like a game in the way it's described. The way it like the way it would feel to play any sort of game. This just doesn't, I don't know. It's an experience, clearly. But even like VR experiences, which I've done, like again, it just didn't quite convince me that that's what was happening here. But maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's something with this tech that we'll find out, or maybe that's just, I don't know, the way it's going to be. So
yeah,
either way, I'll let it go. But part of it was like keeping me at okay. Here's the other thing. Wang, I love this character. I'm like actually really interested in this guy, but when he goes into this game, it doesn't feel like him anymore. He like becomes another person, And that is the other thing is I'm like, where's Wong? Like, like every now and then we get a hint of like Wong, who's the one driving this character, but he like takes on the persona of whatever like login he uses, and then he like plays to it, which is strange. I guess we also failed to mention, and this is a big moment, and also again kind of a spoiler for part 2. He stops the production on this like filament thing that he's working on, and when he stops it, which comes at the advice of somebody who's part of this organization, that stops the timer, and he no longer sees it.
That fissure thing that happens too when he goes out, like they're waiting to see this like universal like fissure thing that no one can predict, and then the whole like universe shakes or something.
Yeah, it's background radiation. Yeah,
background
yeah.
microwave. Yeah.
Yeah, so somehow they're able to manipulate that, which is wild. I'm not an expert enough in that stuff to like explain it, but yeah. So he has these confirmations that he goes through, but then he like, it's interesting because when he stops work on this thing, the timer stops. But my other problem is that he just like sets all of this aside to explore this game. How can you just like have this life-altering thing happen to you, and then all of a sudden you're just like spending all this time in this game, and like I could get that like maybe it's really addictive or like something about it is like pulling him back, but we don't get that. You know what I mean? Like we don't get those details, and that's what I'm saying. All right, I feel disconnected from the character a little bit.
You want to talk
we just see him going back to it over and over again. We're like, why is he doing this?
And if you want to talk about disconnected too, like we find out early on that he has a wife and kid. So
Yeah.
like he's like we don't hear I haven't heard about them again, and he's out here on the game, and he's meeting with secret organizations and all this other stuff, and
yeah, he meets with this group of fellow gamers, which I thought was interesting. But like the organization running it is like, because the thing that did feel like a game was at the end they're like, return for the next part where we see what happens next.
yeah, after each population is like extinct, really, it seems like they're like, all right, yeah, sorry, that population, you'll have to wait for this to fast forward like 100,000 years or something insane, like or 1,000 years for another population to build up. And like the idea of society only advancing during those stable periods is an interesting one as well, because it's like possible commentary on like the advancement of literature and science and all these other things when you're in a safe and like stable environment versus a volatile one.
So to talk game a little bit too, though, the implication I'm getting is that it is telling a persistent storyline, which we do see in a lot of games today, and people are logging in to experience it. But he like when he finds other players, they've experienced other ones. I'm unclear. Like, are they able to play through things at their own speed? Or are they all part of like a shared experience
MMO
that
experience.
he just wasn't logged in for at times? This is the kind of stuff where it's like you kind of have to define that as a game. Like if people are all playing it, are they all playing their own game? And if so, how are they interacting with each other?
It definitely takes on some of that abstract sort of like alien like universe elements to it at times. Like I just like because I'm not sure, I can't define it either for you. Just based on like everything we read, it seems like it's only really relevant when he's involved in it. But then again, like people are also like everyone's trying to solve the 3-body problem at the same time. So maybe it is just like these, because he goes in the first time he goes in, it's like the 180th something civilization. So I have to assume it's like persistent, like you said, like it's just everyone interacting with it at the same time. And I did want to mention too, like within the game, how the suns are interacting. It was interesting to hear like, you know, the sun didn't rise this day, or they were all three aligned this other day, and like the different ways that was affecting the world. I assume that there's like some scientific backing and like the ways that.
Well, this is all about that 3-body problem I've been talking to you about. So like there's all these different solutions for how they could orbit each other in a way that would be predictable, and they would start to, maybe they would form some sort of like repeatable, trackable path. In reality, when you take the 3 bodies and throw them together, they just behave erratically. And usually one of the bodies ends up being ejected, which they talk about at one point with like the like billiard ball example and stuff, and like one gets shot out into space. And this is like example that Asimov, I think, or Arthur C. Clarke proposed. Again, I'm not a mathematician. I can't describe to you like the math behind it at all, but just the video I watched was talking about how like there are different solutions for it where you can form these like repeatable systems, but in nature that just doesn't tend to play out that way. And instead you get these really erratic systems that you can't really predict, and they tend to be unstable. They don't last for super long because of that.
Yeah.
And I guess the implication is that this civilization is from one such system. And we see that with the behavior of the stars in the sky and or the suns in the sky, and how sometimes there's just two. And I love that like one part where it's like, you've mentioned a third sun, that's blasphemy, we should burn you alive for that. Like,
Yeah.
How dare you say there's a third sun, like, and,
This is
and
like what
so
the NPCs are saying. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like touching in on, again, the idea of like politics versus truth, right? Like, they've clearly developed a system where like the third sun is a myth, do not speak of it. And then he's like, no, the third sun's coming.
And then they go outside and there's three suns. There's like a whatever they call it, like a tri-solar, rising or whatever. And
yeah,
like,
because this is like the tri-solar system. We hear that name some, and like this organization around it. So I think that's going to become something we're going to hear more about, this whole tri-solar situation.
and this like kind of club that he's joined now that are trying to figure it out too, this ETO or whatever. And that leads us to like kind of the end of what we got, which is like they
met Einstein. I think he's an NPC, but they meet Einstein as an NPC.
They do meet NPC Einstein. So he goes back in for kind of the final time, it seems, to the VR, to this game, the three body. He sees like this army of like little things, and somebody's like, oh yeah, they're like getting their ship and they're leaving. And then they're like that's like the message to us, that it seems that they're leaving on their way to us.
Yeah, they're on their way to another system. It's like a nearby system that has a stable orbit, and you're like, I don't think it's like confirmed that it's Earth, but it definitely seems like it's Earth. Also, at one point, he like forms a computer with an army.
Yeah,
that was a really wild thing where it was like raising up of flags or something, and they use a bunch of people to like simulate a computer.
30 million people or something. Some
I think it's
insane
3 million. Yeah, it's some crazy number, but it's like an army that they build just to build a computer because no computers exist in this world. And that's like one of their solutions that they come up with. So again, it's unclear to me like what this is. Is this history? Is this like influencing something? What is this game? And that just comes back to like, there's just so much we don't know yet. And that's why it's hard to talk about this with any sort of specificity. It's just hints of stuff.
Definitely. And I have one other comparison I wanted to make for this too, and it's Ender's Game. The idea of like someone interacting with a video game-esque kind of thing, and then spoilers for Ender's Game, you come to find out near the end that like, oh, that whole time that wasn't a game, like that was actual combat, and these aliens and all this other stuff was actually being interacted with. And so in that way, like playing a game, not knowing that there's like larger implications, and then finding out that there's actual, aliens and possible like ramifications of that.
And they talk about this shooter and farmer hypothesis about reality, and how like it basically, I'm not going to explain them fully, but like talking about how like two-dimensional beings, how they would perceive interactions with a three-dimensional being, and how things would seem to have like these bizarre explanations. And so like I think he's trying to like do some of that here. Maybe there's like another dimension. Maybe these aliens are like able to manipulate time or something else. And so maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to us currently because we just don't understand enough about how they perceive reality. Which again, touching a little bit into arrival territory. So yeah, I mean, I'll be really curious to see how this comes together. Do I feel better about the explanations around the VR stuff, or does it continue to be something that I'm bumping up against? I honestly don't know, but I'm curious.
I'm excited to see where this ends. I'm glad that we've got all this set up. We're gonna go into the show now. I'm excited to see how it's adapted and how like maybe some of the game stuff is more coherent
from a modern TV perspective. It's going to be more character focused than the book is. And I personally am excited about that. Now, I also expect that it's going to be changed in dramatic ways. And it's probably going to feel quite different than what we got here. But I'm excited, man. I'm curious enough. And like, we slammed the Double Ds for their handling of season 8 of Game of Thrones. We can talk about this next week. But I'm still cautiously excited about this show just because it is so big and it's such an interesting concept that I want to see it done well, and I hope that they can do it. So I'm going to go in with my eyes open and see what happens. And so next week, we will be talking about just the show only. But if you enjoyed our coverage of the book, please let us know in the form of a rating and review or comment on this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. We're trying to creep ever closer to 1,000 subscribers, so help us out, add to the number. we would greatly appreciate it.
And make sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. We're also on, Blue Sky, TikTok. Look for us wherever you may be.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/Ink2Film. We just released an episode on Wonka, 2023 with Timothée Chalamet, who we had just covered in Dune Part 2. So that was fun to talk about. And we had just covered Wonka, honestly, like at the end of last year. So it's fairly, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. So talking about Wonka was a fun one. So if you're curious, our thoughts on that new film, check out our Patreon. That's where you're going to be able to get it.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's it. All that's left to do is to dehydrate and rehydrate next week. So until next time,
keep adapting.